Barania, securing the Hastily formed network.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I guess. It's always hard to be the lunchtime speaker because I think I lose to the food trucks upstairs. So I want to thank all of you for hanging out with me. I promise there will be food afterwards, okay? So let's get on through this. And what I'd like to do is, first of all, if you have any questions, since it is such a small group, feel free to ask them, and I'll try to answer them right then and there. I want to talk about sort of an interesting trend I noticed. So I was here for the last two presentations. So we started off with, was anyone here for the statistics discussion that started off this morning? Right, so you saw the discussion of statistics, and then you saw the gentleman who came right afterwards who was using statistics, and that person was in turn using pictures of airplanes dropping water on fires and stuff, right? So I want to show you the next logical progression, which is the fact that I'm actually talking about airplanes that are dropping water on fires. So I'm sure that I will use some sort of metaphor or analogy that will be used by whoever is following me next. So just watch for that. What I'd like to do is introduce myself and the team that I work with at Cisco, and then we're going to talk about something called the Hastily formed network. I will talk about what HFNs are and some examples of them, and we'll talk then about what security and HFNs and where the intersection of these things come in. And like I said, we're going to talk about some of the examples that we've seen from some of our most recent incidents. This is a very interesting place because when we talk about security as mission critical, typically, we're talking about often lost information, intellectual property, some sort of dollar value, some sort of monetary value if you're a business or an enterprise or what have you. In this area, there's not a lot of money in it, but it's invariably kind of mission critical to somebody. Typically, when we're working in public safety and humanitarian relief, potentially you're talking about putting people physically at risk. So that's something that we have to be very mindful of as we go through this process here. So a little bit of introductions first. I have been at Cisco since 1996, a really long time. Don't think about it too long. I'm actually the team lead for a team inside of Cisco called Cisco Tactical Operations. We're sort of the networking paramedics, if you will. We go into environments when a disaster or a crisis has happened, and we will actually establish connectivity for first responders, critical infrastructure, and the continuity of government. We will go into these environments when most other people are getting away, when you won't normally find an IT organization or a bunch of techies running around. That's kind of where we go into. I am also the chair of something called the Global VSAT Forum Cybersecurity Task Force. The GVF is the industry organization that represents the satellite industry. And for those of you who've been to Black Hat and DEF CON recently, you might have heard that satellite cybersecurity is actually now in the news. So one of the things I do is work on that particular topic. Before I got into all this emergency response stuff, I was doing a different kind of incident response, which is information security, information assurance, security architecture, and I was a security consultant for a little while. And then there's this thing out in the desert you might have heard of called Burning Man. I'm an emergency medical supervisor out there. So again, I wear a lot of incident response type hats, both in my day job as well as outside of my day job. And then a number of incidents I've been part of. I've been doing disaster relief for more than 20 years, including September 11th, Hurricane Katrina, Haiti, Japan. This photo with me in the helicopter here is about 2 weeks old, and I was in Vanuatu, which is a place I could not find on the map 2 months ago, after Cyclone Pam. So we just came back from an emergency response just like last week. So Cisco Tactical Operations. Why does a vendor have a team called Tactical Operations? Do you guys bust down doors with routers and stuff? It turns out almost, but not quite. Our team was created after September 11th to support primarily military operations in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. So if you needed network engineers to go somewhere outside of the green zone in Baghdad during the height of the war, that was a kind of tasking that fell to our team. Then in 2005, this thing called Hurricane Katrina happened, and Cisco, like many other tech companies, said, hey, if you're a nice techie and you want to go help out in New Orleans, just take 2 weeks and go. So about 200 Cisco employees were self-deployed into the disaster zone around Hurricane Katrina. But if you think about it, it doesn't matter how many CCIEs you have or how smart you are, but if you're living in a cubicle in Silicon Valley and you suddenly are finding yourself in a disaster zone, sometimes you're going to cause more problems than you solve. So coming out of Katrina's experience, our team, as a company, they said, well, we're going to get asked because of things like climate change and the fact that everyone's moving to IP and the internet, we're going to get asked again and again and again to go into crisis situations, to do humanitarian networks. How do we do this? So our team was retasked in 2005 from primarily a military warfighting mission to what is primarily what we call HADR operations, humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. The people on our team come from a lot of different backgrounds. We have both technical and non-technical people on our team, but most of us have worn different hats before we ever came into this job. So yes, a lot of us are network engineers and techies, but there's also people who are current and former firefighters, current and former military folks, people who have been in the field before, a lot of field work experience. And that kind of combination is really what you need to go out there and sustain yourself successfully in the middle of a challenged environment. These vehicles, by the way, these are some of our vehicles. The big black truck with the satellite dish on it is called a NERV, the Network Emergency Response Vehicle. There is one here in the Bay Area. That's kind of our flagship response unit. But we also have a number of things like satellite kits, and I'll show you some of this stuff as we get further along. So where have we been? This slide here actually lists a number of our responses. You can actually see that our team's first humanitarian response was during Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It's interesting that we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of Katrina now. And then our most recent response was just last week in Vanuatu to Cyclone Pam. But for the longest time, I had to tell my parents what it was that I did for a living. And I always told them if Anderson Cooper was there, chances are I was probably there too. So that's kind of how I explain what we do. So we will go into these kind of environments where you wouldn't typically find a vendor or a tech company on the ground in these environments, but we're there because hospitals need to come back up and operate. Search and rescue teams need to operate. Security and law enforcement needs to operate in these kind of environments. And so we're primarily focused on making sure those essential services remain up or come back up so that they can execute their critical mission related to whatever the crisis was. So I wanted to breeze through that real quick here before we get going. All right, any questions so far? Yes, question.
Yeah, what was Operation Verdict?
Operation Verdict was the response to the Measurely trial in the East Bay a couple of years ago. Yeah, we were providing a network for the Oakland Office of Emergency Services. I thought there was another question. Yes. The question is whether we still do military operations. We do work with the military a lot. Like we work with the Philippine military during Haiyan, and we work with organizations like the United States Pacific Command, but primarily around humanitarian assistance and disaster relief missions. So we don't have a war-fighting mission anymore. There's actually another team inside of the company that actually scaled up and took that role over for us so that we could focus on humanitarian assistance type operations. So everything we do is unclassified. Everything that we do is, there's no secret sauce or anything like that. So people can blog about us, tweet about us. Actually, initially, for the longest time, there was no page on Cisco.com that talked about our team because what we were doing was actually considered a closely held secret within the company. We didn't want to advertise that this team actually existed. And then we had to transition to, well, now we need to get a Facebook page, we need to get a Twitter account, and who's going to run the social media for our team and stuff like that. So, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Is there another team that runs network out for civilian population?
The civilian population as related to like emergency response and things like this?
General people lost
Yeah, so the thing that you're talking about, so the question was, is there a team or does this team work on networking for civilian populations and things to that effect? And the answer is yes, we do. So there's this initiative called Connecting with Communities, or CWC, that's the term the United Nations uses, which is to not just connect the responders, but to get people who are affected by the emergency back online, because obviously once you get people connected again, then suddenly they can use that connectivity to actually become more enabled in their own personal responses. And that is part of the charter of our team. We do those kind of missions. So let's talk a little bit about what the heck a hastily formed network is. This top photograph is actually us. This device right here is actually what's called a gator dish. It's an inflatable satellite dish. So the idea is a 2.4 meter dish is too big to fit in the hold of a 737 to fly somewhere. So what we do is we basically use this thing that looks like a big beach ball. So we take it out, we pump it full of air, and it's a satellite reflector. So it's how you get, it's a lightweight, rapidly deployable satellite infrastructure. This is actually Super Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013. And the photograph with the NERV and that helicopter, those of you who are local here might recognize that that's Moffett Field down the road here. And that's with the 129th Rescue Wing, which is the combat search and rescue team that's based down at Moffett. We do joint training with them. So all crisis responders have the same problem. It doesn't matter whether you are a hospital, whether you are a volunteer organization like the Red Cross, whether you're the United Nations, whether you are a defense agency, whether you are a critical infrastructure provider like a power or a telecoms company. And the essential problem relative to technology is how do I get the right information at the right time, in the right format, to the right person, and on the right device. We call this the 5 rights of emergency communications. If any of those rights is wrong, you've just added to the fog of war, you've just added to the confusion, you haven't subtracted from it. This is the fundamental problem that all crisis communicators are trying to solve. Whether anyone here happen to be a ham radio operator? Right, so I'm N6ILG as well, so I also speak radio. Even ham radio operators have the same fundamental problem, even though they aren't connected necessarily to the internet. They aren't, they may be using Morse code or what have you. But again, this is the same fundamental problem which exists outside of any particular technology. The 5 rights of emergency communications. At the same time, the need and the desire for connectivity in crises is changing. There's an evolution going on in society, in industry, in government, to go from these old world environments where you just had a radio or maybe a telephone to things like integrated data and radio connectivity. You went from a single device like a desktop computer to BYOD, or what we call in our team BYODD, bring your own device to the disaster. So those of you who are familiar with the BYOD phenomena in business and in the enterprise and in IT, we see that same phenomena occurring in the field in the middle of a crisis zone. Initially, it was for closed teams, open collaboration. How many of you are on social media of any sort? Instagram, Facebook, Twitter? Okay. A disaster happens, a crisis happens. A building here in San Francisco is on fire. There's 200 people with their cell phones doing this. And they're putting it up on Instagram or Twitter or what have you, right? We've all seen this. In fact, for those of you who don't know this, the first use of the hashtag on Twitter, the concept of a hashtag, was first used in October of 2007 for the San Diego fires. Big wildfires in San Diego were going on at that time, and that was where the hashtag first came from. Now we use it for everything. But the hashtag concept itself was first used in an emergency context. So we go from fixed locations, like a headquarters or an emergency operations center, to the fact that people want connectivity everywhere in the middle of a crisis. Now, before we get too far along, I want to state this straight up. Emergency communicators, people who actually make technology happen in a disaster, whether they're ham radio people or internet people like myself or anything in between, emergency communications has never saved a single life. People who say that communication saves lives is actually they're using a little hyperbole. And the reality is this. You still need the firefighter to dig somebody out of the rubble. You still need somebody to deliver food and water to someone who is hungry. You still need to provide shelter to someone who needs it, who's a refugee. Communications facilitates all of those things. It is a secondary service, which is absolutely critical, but it is not the end goal. The end goal is to make sure that whoever needs help and who needs service gets it. So the goal here is we want to provide mission workflow and productivity benefits that help save lives and speed recovery to affected communities. It is about the message and not the medium. So how do we do that? So what challenges are there? So the term that people use in our space is called ICT, Information and Computing Technologies. It's computers, networks, the whole bit. So when you see ICT, think of all the stuff that you would think of as IT. When you have a disaster, when you have a crisis, whether it's Katrina, whether it's Haiti, whether it's 9/11, these are the typical things that we find happening in a crisis. First of all, technology is absolutely needed because people need to use information. But often that technology or that infrastructure is either overwhelmed or destroyed. First of all, there's a lack of power. There is often a degraded telephony infrastructure. People can't make phone calls. The cell phones are overloaded, or the cell towers are down, or what have you. The radio infrastructure, or what's called push-to-talk radio, the radio infrastructure is degraded. Maybe it's overloaded. Maybe your trunked radio systems, the towers for your trunked radio systems are overwhelmed. There's a lack of interoperability. The previous speaker before me was actually using it as a metaphor where he talked about the police department and the fire department not able to talk to each other. Well, that kind of thing actually happens in this world. Oversubscribed services, lack of internet access, few IT resources, and a lack of trained staff. And this is where we're going to for the remainder of this talk. During Haiti in 2010, most of the techies, representative of you folks in this audience, two things either happened to them in the earthquake. One is that they either bailed and they evacuated out to Florida or some other country. They got out of Haiti. Or two, they were dead. So who brings back the infrastructure? Who brings back the technology when your techies are dead? So that is one of the challenges. And then the other thing is lack of information security. Security is a real challenge in this environment. You think security is hard I used to work for Cisco's Infosec team, and it was hard to get my IT department in Building 12 down on the San Jose campus to actually pay attention to why you should use good passwords and why you should use SSL instead of using Telnet and unencrypted sessions. Try doing that in the middle of a crisis. It's a very challenged environment. And the reality is this, is that when you work in this environment, so does anyone here not have a smartphone, laptop, or tablet device with them right now on their person? Does anyone here have no device whatsoever on them? Right? We're all connected. We all brought a laptop. We all brought a smartphone. We all brought some sort of tablet. The reality is, in a crisis environment, people aren't heads down like some of you are right now in this room. Techies live heads down. We're always looking at our screens. In emergency response and humanitarian relief, people are heads up because guess what? The real problem is out here in the world. It's not down here on your screen. So bringing these two worlds together is actually an ongoing challenge. So how do you do information security? How do you do anything, incident response in the middle of that? So the term hastily formed network was created by the Naval Postgraduate School to describe emergency networks that did not exist before a particular event. So an earthquake happens, a hurricane hits, some sort of crisis happens, and suddenly where there was no connectivity, you suddenly need connectivity. Either because the old connectivity is gone or destroyed or overwhelmed, or because there simply wasn't any to begin with. So instant emergency networks. HFNs are portable, so you got to be able to bring it in. You have to be, it's typically IP-based, and these are deployed when a pre-existing network is either overwhelmed or unavailable or what have you. And the goal of an HFN is to enable people who are actually on scene and in the field to talk to remote responders, to coordinate their operations, to enable connectivity for ordinary individuals who've been affected by the crisis, to establish command and control. And the goal here of an HFN is to enable the people in the middle of the affected area to communicate amongst themselves as well as to the outside world. How do you tell the rest of the world that you need medicine or blankets or shelter or anything? You need connectivity to make that happen. So these are actually some of our volunteers using some of our kits here and deploying some of this stuff in training and exercise. So HFNs are fundamentally portable, rapidly deployable, and the other thing is they are interim. Like I said, we're the networking paramedics. We aren't the networking, let's see, where do I fall over with this? We aren't the networking plastic surgeon. We're not there to take you to the end-to-end life cycle of things. Once the pre-existing networking or communications infrastructure comes back, maybe the cell phone carrier comes back, this stuff gets packed up and sent home, right? It's interim. We're a gap filler. Typically, you see technologies like Wi-Fi, satellite communications, WiMAX. You're starting to see some things like around LTE also deployed in this space, but those are kind of your basic building blocks of this kind of technology. The top photo up here is actually an inflated Gator satellite dish, the inflatable dish in Guijuan at the Philippines. You see some emergency communications vehicles. You see down here one of these kits, these sort of networks in a box kind of kits. You can actually see here in the corner, this is actually, it's hard to see if you're a little bit further away, but this thing with the fire engine here, that's actually a mesh wireless access point that's providing network connectivity during actually a simulated exercise where we simulated that a high-rise building was on fire. And so you had 200 firefighters running around and they're trying to put out a simulated fire, and we were doing things like wireless connectivity for their helmet cameras and things along those lines. So what are examples of hastily formed networks? Any questions about the concept before I move on here? So this is Port-au-Prince, Haiti, 2010. You all saw what that place looked like after the earthquake. There was 250,000 fatalities in this event. It was actually probably one of the most significant disasters of our new century here. This is an example of an HFN. What you see here is that there is a satellite landing zone here at the airport, and then using point-to-point terrestrial shots, you're actually distributing the network to these other locations, whether they're staging areas, feeding and support sites, or what have you. The reason why is because satellite dishes are actually really rare in a disaster. They don't just happen everywhere. Not everyone has the ability to afford them. So the idea is you bring in one satellite dish, and then you use terrestrial point-to-point wireless or some other method to actually distribute the network around. And in this case, this network was actually linked to the USNS Comfort, which was actually a hospital ship sitting in the bay. And what this network was being used for, among other things, was actually for medevac support. So as people were being dug out of the rubble by urban search and rescue teams, the helicopter airlifts, in other words, helicopters would fly off of the ship, go to some of these field hospital locations, pick up patients, and then deliver them back to the Comfort for advanced medical care. So this is what these networks are used for. They aren't typically high bandwidth. The people who actually sit right on the other side of my desk in San Jose, they work on multi-terabit carrier networks, and then here I am working on the far end of a thin sippy straw of satellite connectivity. It's a very strange thing, you know, so your idea of high bandwidth is not my idea of high bandwidth. I'm happy if I can get a megabit sometimes. So that's what 2010 looks like. This is what the NERV looks like. So again, this big black truck that Cisco has, this is our internal infrastructure. We actually establish VPNs across the public internet. We have core routers, mesh networks, voice over IP, telepresence. We use a technology called Cisco iPix to actually bring together, you know, so the police radio and the fire radio that don't talk to each other, are incompatible. We actually bring them into voice over IP, And once they're just voice over IP, we can mix and match them as we need to. So we can actually enable first responders to communicate even if their infrastructure, when they showed up on scene, aren't compatible with one another. Question?
In that case, does that require the endpoints to be configured?
Not at all, and that's the brilliant thing about it, because it happens invisibly. If we're doing our job right, the cop or the firefighter doesn't know why they can suddenly talk to the other organization. It happens kind of invisibly in the background. We want to be as transparent as possible, and the reality is when you're in a crisis environment, people will naturally revert to their lowest level of training. So if you show up at an emergency scene and all of a sudden the radio that you use day to day is suddenly replaced by a different radio, that's kind of a headache, right? All of you who have smartphones here know exactly where all your applications are, your most used one anyway, because you have muscle memory supporting that. So you got to think about sort of usability and the user experience. So you want people to be able to use their lowest level muscle memory to support whatever they need to do. Question?
I assume all the BYOD lots of people.
We can, and actually that's one of the things I'll get to and as we start going along here. So hold your question, and if I don't answer it, come back to me. Right here. Okay.
For the NERVs, do you sell this actually as a solution that cities can buy?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So there is no line item. You can't go to Cisco.com and order a NERV. It's really funny. I don't know how many of you have actually ever bought anything from us, but it's pretty Byzantine, actually. But I can assure you that there is no Cisco line item for a NERV. However, what we do as part of the business side of what we do is we have proven builds of materials and architectures that we provide. So one of the things that we talk about a little bit later here is Ferguson, Missouri, and the vehicle that was actually attacked is actually based on our NERV architecture. So hold that thought, I'll get to it in a little bit. But the reality is that our operations are funded, our humanitarian operations, all those deployments you saw, is funded through corporate social responsibility. So Cisco doesn't charge for what we do. I mean, I'm one of the few things that Cisco actually gives away for free. Anyone who's ever had to buy SmartNet knows that this is a very rare thing. But Cisco gives us away for free because it's considered the right thing to do, yada, yada, yada. But if you did want to buy one, I could actually point to an account manager. I am not responsible for any sales or anything like that. So even though I'm using a vendor slide deck here, and I actually am a vendor, I don't have any financial interest in selling you guys anything on anything here. We're pretty much talking just as sharing some of our experiences and a lot of war stories, basically. Any other questions before I carry on? So the other thing that we just did here is another hastily formed network example, Ebola in West Africa. Our team was actually asked, so those of you who might have heard about this, so Ebola hit 3 countries in West Africa, right? Guinea, Sierra Leone, Liberia. All of a sudden, and when you talk about something that is increasing at a literal geometric rate like Ebola was last year, data becomes absolutely key to getting in front of the disease, because the disease is moving at this level where it's doubling every 3 weeks. You have to have effective data collection and effective communication to get in front of and contain Ebola, right? So this network here, on this left-hand side here, I just kind of drew one up on the slide, but this was 20 remote locations in Sierra Leone and Liberia. These are what are called ETUs, or Ebola treatment units. These are clinics, health facilities. These are places where Ebola patients are actually being treated, or places where disease surveillance experts are actually coming together to actually work. And then they're going over satellite, and one of the things that happened was that this network was put into place. So the satellite network was deployed pretty early on without any security in it. And it was donated by a company called Eutelsat, which is one of the big 4 satellite service providers in the world. And they said, hey, you know what, because this is Ebola, we're going to give you your first 100 gigs per month free. Okay? They're going to donate it, which is pretty awesome of them, right? It's pretty awesome that the satellite service provider is going to give the humanitarian community access to satellite data for free for a little bit. Right. And then what happened was they realized that in 2 weeks they were blowing through that. Why? No one knew. No one knew. And we're going to come back to this in a little bit here, because we found out why. So at any rate, what we wound up doing was we actually deployed, instead of actually deploying security in the field, at the field locations, because some of these locations were so remote that they could only be reached by donkey. Can you imagine taking a router or a firewall, strapping it to the back of a donkey, and then hiking it into some place? It's going to take you weeks. And that's hoping that the box actually survives the trip and makes it there in one place. And then who does the deployment? Who do you trust out there who's actually going to plug this thing in and connect the cables correctly? So what we did was we actually deployed this device here, the Meraki MX80, actually at the teleport side, on the other end of the satellite link to do the security, because it was going to take so long to get into the field that it just wasn't practical to do so. So that is what hastily formed networks look like. They are often based on satellite. There's a lot of Wi-Fi. The technology is actually not that different than what you're used to in an office environment, in a business environment, in day-to-day life. Many of you are often at home having higher bandwidth than we do in these networks. So where does security come into this? What are we really trying to do when it comes to security? The first thing we are trying to do is protect the mission. The mission absolutely comes first, right? We are there for some reason. Some awful thing has happened, whether it is the Dadaab refugee camp, which is the world's largest refugee camp in Kenya, whether it is Zatari in Jordan, which is supporting refugees from Syria, whether it is Philippines, whether it is Katrina, whether it's a wildfire in Northern California. We are always trying to protect the mission first. We obviously want to keep bad things out, but we also got to keep bad things from getting out. Because I'll tell you right now, that whole BYOD problem, humanitarian laptops are some of the most Trojan devices I've ever seen. People are out there. They are outside of their organization's firewall. They are well outside of their organization's IT support. Who knows what they're plugging in? They're plugging into like a cyber cafe in Nigeria and that kind of environment, right? So think about what happens there. So we need to keep critical services running. The services that are absolutely mission critical for the incident commander, for the paramedics, for the hospital, we need to keep those things going. We need to know what's going on the network and on the devices. And just like all the rest of you, we are challenged to balance security versus access. We have to make that call, and we have to get it right every single time. Because the price of not getting it right sometimes is very high. And that's not really a lot of hyperbole. Sometimes that's actually literally true, though, that we have to get it right every time. These photographs here, actually, this top photograph, some of you who are local here may recognize this. This is the San Bruno gas pipeline explosion not too far away from here in 2010, that PG&E pipeline that blew up and took out 40, 50 homes. That is actually me inside the NERV. We were on scene. We were on scene for that fire for 3 days, providing a lot of emergency networking and communication support for the entire incident management team. Because when the fire blew up, the first thing that you do when a fire happens is you kill the power. Because you don't want firefighters spraying water on live energized power lines. That's bad. So what you do is you kill the power in this area. So all of a sudden, you go into that area, and once the batteries on the cell phone networks go away, there's no connectivity. You've created basically a dead zone in the middle of San Bruno, California. So what we were there to do was actually provide the connectivity for law enforcement, for fire, for rescue, for PG&E, for other folks there at the scene. And we were called up by CAL FIRE for that particular response. So this is what our world looks like. It's literally, you guys talk about firewalls, I talk about firewalls too, but then actually sometimes there's actually real fire right outside the door. So this is kind of one of those places where the metaphorical and the literal actually kind of come together. So I started off back in the 90s doing firewall administration. And stop me if you've heard this one before. Someone can't do something. I'm trying to use an application. I'm trying to get to some site. Can you turn off the firewall so I can get to it? Right? I can't get to something. The first thing that's suspect is the firewall. Turn it off. Right? I mean, I think everyone has run into this before. when you go into a crisis zone, one of the big pressures that's on people who do this kind of work is they need to get it up yesterday. They need to get this network, because remember, this network didn't exist. It doesn't exist. It needs to exist. It needed to exist yesterday. Because if this network doesn't exist, babies will die. Right? I mean, that's kind of how the story goes. So, I don't have time to secure the infrastructure. I have to get this site up, and then move on to my next site, and then move on to my next site, and then move on to my next site. This is the #1 challenge as a security person that we face again and again and again. Security is always seen as an afterthought because the existence of the network, the existence of the infrastructure is considered so critical that security falls like to priority number 10. Now, turning that on its head, if the network is that critical, you really ought to secure it. Right? So what we tell people is that just because it's a hastily formed network does not mean it's an ad hoc or unplanned network. Plan these networks in advance. Plan your security into your infrastructure before you actually need to break it out. So a lot of times these networking kits are actually just kits. They sit in a Pelican case and they're ready to go and they have some sort of fixed configuration in them and all you need to do is plug them in and turn them on. Well, if that's the case, you can build security into that network. You can set it up in the configuration. So this vehicle right here is, they don't have them anymore. The American Red Cross, they're called ECRVs, Emergency Communications Response Vehicles. They are both radio trucks, so they have ham radio and other stuff in there, but they're also networking assets. They have Wi-Fi and point-to-point shots and some other stuff in there. They're actually really cool things. And I used to volunteer on these vehicles back when I was doing stuff with the Red Cross. And then this is actually Camp Roberts, California, where we're actually using wind and solar power to actually power the satellite dish, which is then powering a mesh wireless network. So we get to play with some sort of alternative technologies and things like that in places where power isn't available. So, basic security 101. This shouldn't be surprising to anybody in this room. A lot of the same basic security principles that we all use day to day also apply to hastily formed networks. First of all, principle of least access, right? We don't leave things wide open if you can at all help it. But the problem is advanced authentication, like two-factor authentication, radius, and things like that, that may not be available to you. Right? So you got to think about the fact that this is not an enterprise network. This is not a business network. This is not some ISP class network. This is something you just took out of a Pelican case and plugged it in. There's no Active Directory in the middle of Port Vila, Vanuatu when you're sitting in a tent somewhere. So how do you do authentication and role-based access control? Those are things you need to think about because some of those dependencies on other resources aren't there. That satellite, so for those of you who don't know, when a big heavy rainstorm comes in, sometimes satellite networks go down because of rain fade, right? The heavy rain actually attenuates the satellite signal to the point where your link to the outside world will go down for a little while. So if you're depending on resources on the other end of that link for your local access and authentication, all of a sudden you created a denial of service attack on your local infrastructure when the rain comes in. We assume that threats may come from anywhere in the network. We want to strive for simplicity. Once the network is configured, the security architecture should really establish itself, and then we realize that there's personnel already who have too much to do. And we need to be able to automate as much of this as possible. We need defense in depth, because there is no such thing as a security silver bullet. And anyone who's trying to say that is trying to sell you something. That's the other conference here in town this week. On-scene staff may have little to no security background, right? So typically in these environments, you are trying to use local staff whenever possible, but very rarely do you run into somebody who has a CISSP out there in the middle of nowhere, right? Security knowledgeable people are harder to find than networking or server administration people, and those individuals are pretty rare as well, right? So acceptable use policies, incident response may be undefined. In other words, something like the United Nations Emergency Telecoms Cluster will come in. So the ETC is the organization within the United Nations that has the mandate to create emergency networks for humanitarian response organizations. ETC comes in, they set up a Wi-Fi cloud. They throw up a satellite dish. Now there's a place where humanitarian responders from 12 different organizations can come to and work. Okay, but now who establishes the AUP for that? Who is going to monitor that network and then say, hey, guess what? Doctors Without Borders, you're no longer allowed to be on the network because your machine is Trojan, I'm going to kick you off. Blacklisting or whitelisting traffic. It's very hard to figure out those things. You may have a hard time figuring out where your policies are back in your home office, but out in the field, it gets a lot harder. Technology is easy, politics is hard, and politics is especially hard in these kind of environments. Come on, PowerPoint. Work with me here, man. Thank you. Anyway, so managing InfoSec in emergencies. One of the downsides of hastily formed networks is that they will often overlook security. Again, that whole idea, I need to get deployed right away. If you have a basic firewall, that's usually where it stops for most organizations. Basic firewall, WPA on the Wi-Fi. It's good to go. Can your users get to Google? Yep. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. So there's often no such thing as a chief security officer in a disaster. Now here's the downside. This is actually a huge risk for responders. If you're an emergency responder and your world is up here, heads up, remember, not heads down, that means that you are not looking for or expecting the attack that is coming towards you. Our team have integrated security at a lot of different levels, but honestly, we're Cisco. We know how to do this stuff because we are trying to sell you this stuff at the other conference, right? But again, we're the exception. We're certainly the exception. So it's very important to get agency buy-in and support. So if you go into an emergency, if you're talking to FEMA or what's called the Comm Unit Leader in the United States, or COML, it's important to talk to the agency. Okay, look, I have the ability to instrument this network and look for attacks. Do you want me to prevent attacks? Do you want me to go into an IPS kind of mode as opposed to just monitoring? And often, you have to spend a lot of time with these organizations and actually explain what you can do and what the threat is, because the person you're talking to, the incident commander, is a 35-year fire veteran who has been on more fires than you can ever count and has breathed more smoke than you've ever imagined, but doesn't know the first thing about how the internet works, doesn't know the first thing about security. So being able to take all of the technology stuff that we're all familiar with, and then turning that into something that they can understand is a key thing. So if nothing else, if you're working in the space, being able to communicate in non-technical language, technical concepts is really important. So HFN security starts with the physical. First things first, you're going into a disaster zone. So when you talk about InfoSec and cybersecurity and stuff for HFNs, layer 1 is where it starts at. Force protection. Don't become part of the problem, right? I mean, on our conference calls in Haiti, you can actually hear gunfire. So do you need to actually be there in the first place? That's something to consider. Physical security of your equipment. Logistics, intelligence, health, and safety. It is easy to go halfway around the world into Haiti or Vanuatu or the Philippines. The hard trick is to sustain yourself once you're there and not become part of the problem. So all of our analysis, when it comes to security, starts at layer 1. This is our layer 1 problem. And then on the other end, we use our own stuff, Ironport, Meraki, et cetera, et cetera. There's other stuff out there that does the same thing. Layer 7 inspection. We turn on all of our automated stuff. We're actually able to say, hey, guess what? We're able to do layer 7 inspection. We can blacklist and whitelist hosts. And then someone asked about quality of service earlier. We can do QoS and bandwidth throttling, because one of the big things you see, aside from all the malware and all the bad traffic, a lot of software updates, because a lot of times these laptops sit in Pelican cases in warehouses for deployment. So the first thing it does is it does Windows updates, right? You take it out, you want to do a Windows update, and now that thin sippy straw of satellite connectivity you have is chewed up downloading stuff from Microsoft. Now, I want people to get Windows updates, right? Because that fixes security problems. But I don't want that to create a denial of service condition on the satellite. So I will do quality of service. I will rate limit, no more than, say, 500 kilobits per second. So your AV updates, your security updates, all that stuff will still get through. It'll just take a little longer. And that way I can prioritize the mission traffic over your sort of security traffic. So throttling software, enabling things like Facebook, but not peer-to-peer, right? Social media is important in an emergency, both for psychosocial support as well as the fact that you want to inform the rest of the world what you're doing. But again, since we're talking about an environment where I don't necessarily control the end device, I don't control people's phones or laptops or what have you, I have to build all the security into the network infrastructure. All the intelligence has to live in the network because I can't touch any of the hosts. I have to assume that every host is contaminated, every host is compromised, and if my experience with Ebola is true, they actually quite often are. It's very funny how you're fighting an actual virus and a computer virus at the same incident. It's very strange. When it comes to satellite connectivity, denial of service is really your primary security concern. Often, in these environments, satellite connectivity is the only way to go. Is the only way to get out. So now you got to protect and police that satellite bandwidth. Botnets, zombies, all that stuff. But then there's also the inappropriate use stuff: YouTube, BitTorrent, peer-to-peer, adult content. All that stuff chews up a lot of bandwidth. So you got to police that. But someone's got to establish that as a policy first. So this is an example. This is the Ebola response network for NetHope. This is that 20 Ebola hospitals and facilities in Sierra Leone. When we first deployed it, we put it in a monitoring mode. So this connectivity here, you can see how the bandwidth utilization is going. And then all of a sudden, we started implementing rate limiting and policing the bandwidth. Now, the number of actual users and devices is still the same or increasing, but you can see the actual bandwidth being used is much less because we're actually throttling things that need to be throttled. We're blocking things that need to be blocked. We're blocking all the botnet traffic from oh my gosh, it was kind of scary to see how many of these laptops. And think about it this way. All those laptops have things like health records in them. So anyone here have to deal with HIPAA and stuff like that? Well, there's no such thing as HIPAA in West Africa, but you got to get the point, right? No, I was trying to keep that from happening, but yeah. Anyway, this was an example where we had a security incident at the Evans Road fire in North Carolina on our truck. A firefighter's laptop came on to the network, already Trojaned, and it started sending spoofed zombie traffic out to the internet, trying to look for other hosts as part of a DDoS botnet. So it created a satellite uplink, a satellite denial of service attack on our own infrastructure. So we created a bunch of VLANs and started throttling like untrusted versus trusted VLANs and stuff. Whoa, I did that, sorry. Here's my mouse. Okay, thank you. So trusted VLANs have access to servers, vehicle resources, and untrusted just get access to the internet. And I'm running out of time here, so I want to fly through the other slides real quick here. This is kind of what our network looks like. So you can see that there's ingress and egress access lists across the way. We do layer 7 inspection for all sorts of applications. Firewalls. Each unit, each kit, each vehicle has its own firewall, but we maintain one policy everywhere, and then we do layer 7 inspection to back that all up. We do things like bogon filtering, inbound and outbound as well, and we do sanity checking for outbound traffic. So the idea is we don't want to be, we want to protect the rest of the internet as well as we're protecting ourselves, because we know that we're going to be a source of bad traffic. Real-time reporting and real-time response. This was the Carlton Complex fire in Washington in 2014. We supported 673 devices on the south zone of that fire. That's, firefighters and support personnel. We documented a ton of attacks against that attack surface. And when we provided that to FEMA, they said that this was the first documented cyber attack against a first responder attack surface that they were aware of. This was just last year, and this should scare everybody because there was nothing special about this fire. It just happened to be that we were there and instrumented to detect it. So when you hear about all these brush fires that are happening and other disasters that are kind of routine, understand, they're all being attacked constantly. We just happen to be able to detect it and pick it up and mitigate some of it. So this is an ongoing challenge. So this is us in Vanuatu. This was actually our headquarters, our network operations center. There's some canvas tarp, a bunch of switches, a couple laptops. And this was Tana Island in Vanuatu, setting up stuff with BT. So, security and hastily formed networks are not mutually exclusive. We're trying to tell the first responder community that they will be attacked. They already are being attacked. We're trying to educate folks like yourselves that this community of responders needs a lot of help. If you're inclined to volunteer with organizations that do stuff like this, please do so. They need it. We have not yet seen targeted attacks ourselves, but it's certainly possible. The Missouri State Highway Patrol, during the Ferguson protest a couple months ago, had a targeted attack against one of their command vehicles. Anonymous did it. We've seen incidents with the Syrian Electronic Army as part of the Syrian civil war, and that has actually resulted in fatalities. Right? Someone goes in and steals the database and then suddenly decides to go into the refugee camp and decides who's Sunni and who's Shia, and then if you're the wrong sect, they separate you guys and then you disappear. That sort of thing happens. So, information security and disaster relief and humanitarian operations is currently vastly underappreciated. Things you guys all take for granted is brand new to this community. And we're in 2015. They are well behind the curve. We've submitted to both FEMA and the United Nations the idea that this is best practices. And then lastly, what I would leave you with here before I take any last questions in the time that we have left, this is a responder safety issue. Responders are at risk from electronic attack. This isn't the cyber Pearl Harbor. This is stuff that's happening day to day. And the failure of these organizations to secure their infrastructure leaves vulnerable populations at additional risk of victimization. If you're already a refugee, if you're already a disaster victim, you are at the mercy of these networks and their security or lack thereof. So these organizations have a duty, which is currently underappreciated, to secure their infrastructure because their mandate to support people who are in crisis, they're letting them down in the electronic space. So with that, I will take any last questions here before we wrap up. Yes?
Coordinate with someone like NGOs, like Vimeo,
Yes, and actually, Invenio is one of the partners that we use. So the question is, do we coordinate with NGOs? Yeah, our team works a lot with the NetHope community, with the United Nations, with the Red Cross, and other, I mean, those are kind of the bread and butter organizations that we talk to a lot. Question?
Yeah, do you know any more about these people who are attacking these types of networks, like what their motivations are?
So right now, based on our own firsthand experience, this is just the stuff that you get exposed to just based on being on the internet. Not specifically targeted necessarily. However, the situation with regards to Syria is a little bit different. We have seen specifically targeted attacks against specific individuals where people wind up dead afterwards. That's happened actually as part of the Syrian civil war. So not domestically, not related to like the firefighters and stuff, but when you start talking about human conflict zones and how there's a cyber component to those things, yeah, we have seen some of that. Question?
Yeah. Do you travel with any kind of read-only media or like media in a box? See what that with?
Sorry, say again, please.
Do you travel with any read-only media, like media in a box, or to have jump in, Linux, Cisco, so that can repurpose equipment in the field?
We don't, but other organizations do. So, for example, like the American Red Cross actually deploys things like Windows servers into the field for their own applications. The problem with us is that we're always supporting somebody day to day, and we don't know who we're going to support on the next incident. But if you're the American Red Cross, you know you're always going to be supporting the American Red Cross in the field. So you can actually tune your server infrastructure and your technology package to just support American Red Cross applications. You know what forms you need, you know what applications you're going to need beforehand. We don't. Yes.
So Washington, D.C. recently had some move to remove encryption from the radios for interoperability. Do you have any comments on that and how that kind of plays out in the Infosec sphere?
Yes. Typically, first responder radios are not encrypted. In that they're usually UHF, VHF, over the air. Even if they're trunk, so be it. Cryptography does sometimes play an issue with regards to interoperability, but the reality is if we're doing a radio bridge where I take your radio that's encrypted and my radio that's unencrypted, we're actually taking the audio out of it, so it's already clear text by the time it gets to me, right? So now the problem is that now if you're bridging two different radios together where it's encrypted and unencrypted, all of a sudden someone tuning into the unencrypted frequency, now here's what would be the encrypted traffic, right? It tends to be rare in this space. It's more for military communications. Although, like SFO, the airport here, even the janitors are carrying P25 radios that are encrypted on them. That are like $5,000 radios. It's kind of crazy, but that's the way it works. And then the last question I have is the lady behind you, please.
So I'm actually just wondering. I know you mentioned responders to disasters, but in the same breath, you're mentioning responders to demonstrations.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a little curious how you reconcile making responders to disasters safer with making responders to protests who are actually going out and harming people also safer.
That's a great question. The reality is that the principles apply to both. So why the incident is happening is secondarily to the process. Responder safety is typically why we bring people into here. So the political motivations for why something is happening is really extraneous. So to take a couple of examples, if you look at Ferguson, for example, so people in this room probably have a lot of different opinions about why Ferguson happened and the validity of those protests. The fact of the matter is that you had people who were rioting in Ferguson. They were burning down things. You still need to coordinate the fire department to put out the building that's on fire. That still needs to happen. The fire department won't go into a place if they feel that the situation is unsafe, right? People think that fire department will charge into a burning building. Sometimes they will. But the reality is that if there is a physical threat or a perception of a threat, whether it's valid or not, they won't go in. You still need to coordinate that stuff.
That wasn't actually my question. My question was, how do you reconcile coordinating fire response with coordinating tear gas attacks on American citizens?
I think that the reality is that we support first responders in maintaining a general sense of public safety. Going back to the Measurely incident, we were supporting the Oakland Office of Emergency Services so that they could actually see what was going on, right? The command stuff that goes on, the decisions that law enforcement takes, is actually secondary to the information that we have. But at the same time, law enforcement and other organizations, they're mining social media. So if you look at some of these incidents, people are like webcasting protests and stuff. I can tell you right now that those organizations are actually doing that. The response community is doing that as well. I actually happen to be pro-technology in these circumstances because accountability matters to everybody, right? So things like body cams and live streaming stuff is actually good for everybody. It protects the public. It protects the public from overreaching response. It also protects responders from an overreaching public. People tend to behave themselves when everyone knows they're on camera. And if there's any other questions, I'm happy to take them offline because I know that we have a next speaker coming up. So I want to thank you very much for your questions and stuff, and have a great day. And thanks to OpenDNS for supporting.